As many of you know, my name is Nathaniel Stein. I am the curator of photography here at the Cincinnati Art Museum, and together with my colleague Emily Bauman and the entire team here at the museum, it has been my honor to organize our presentation of the exhibition Georgia O'Keeffe Photographer, which I hope many of you have just enjoyed upstairs. But we are here right now to enjoy another perspective on the exhibition and on Georgia O'Keeffe. Our special guest tonight, Lisa Volpe, is curator of photography at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. And it was she who, in partnership with the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum, conducted the research that allowed her to bring this project to life first in Houston. So we could have no better guide to lend us insight this evening. And I really want to add my personal thanks to Lisa for sharing her time and her thoughts and this beautiful exhibition with me as I worked my own way into O'Keeffe and photography. And I was just mentioning to her upstairs, this project really has changed the way that I'm able to think about O'Keeffe, and I'm really grateful to Lisa for that. It has been a huge pleasure. Lisa Volpe earned her master's degree at Case Western Reserve University and her PhD at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Prior to her current tenure in Houston, she was curator of the Wichita Art Museum. She has held curatorial posts or fellowships at the Santa Barbara Museum of Art, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and the Cleveland Museum of Art, and taught the history of art at UC Santa Barbara and the Brooks Institute. Her gorgeous exhibition catalog, which I hope you've seen upstairs for Georgia O'Keeffe Photographer, was one of 2 finalists for the Association of American Publishers Prose Awards, and her book for the exhibition Gordon Parks, Stokely Carmichael, and Black Power, which just concluded its run in Houston, was named a must-read by both Esquire and New York magazines. Some of the many other projects that I've admired that Lisa has been involved with include John Davola, As Far as I Could Get, which was a collaboration between the Santa Barbara Museum of Art, LACMA, and the Pomona College Museum of Art, and Chaotic Harmony, Contemporary Korean Photography, which was a collaboration between Houston and Santa Barbara. Looking ahead, her exhibition and book, Robert Frank and Todd Webb, Across America, 1955, will be experiences not to miss later this year, and that project debuts in Houston, I believe, in September. So we are excited for that. Now that I have enumerated the many places Lisa has worked that are west of the Mississippi, not counting Cleveland, I have to mention that not only does she have professional roots in Cleveland, but also she hails from Youngstown, Ohio, which I understand is not actually near to here. But I'm going to claim it for us tonight that she is one of our own, as it were. Let's just ignore Akron and Columbus and Dayton and just pretend like we're neighbors. So we are honored and delighted to host Lisa's lecture titled Through Another Lens, Georgia O'Keeffe's Photography. At the conclusion of her remarks, she will take some questions graciously from the audience, and we will ask you please to wait for a member of staff to bring a microphone to you so that Lisa can hear your question and so that we can all hear your question when you pose it. And with that, I will ask you please to help me in welcoming Lisa Volpe.
Oh my gosh, it's the last venue, guys. It's so wonderful to see you all here. It makes that sting of knowing that this exhibition will close at some point a little less stingy. But I'm so pleased to be here. I'm so thrilled to be speaking with you tonight. And yes, my name is Lisa. I work at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, and I can't believe how beautifully installed this exhibition is here at the Cincinnati Art Museum. So thank you especially to Nathaniel, it looks stunning, and to Haley for bringing me here, and to all of you for coming tonight. Georgia O'Keeffe is certainly one of our most beloved art icons, and I truly believe that seeing and understanding O'Keeffe's photography helps us see and understand all of her art and the artist herself a little better. So tonight we're going to explore O'Keeffe through that lens, through the lens of photography. We'll be looking at her photographic past, the images present in the exhibition, and what they tell us about her methods, mixed with some information about my own methods to attribute them. And we'll conclude with the research that still needs to be done in the future. I'm recruiting for that, just so you know. So let's begin with O'Keeffe's life in photography. Even without the more than 400 extant images that I've been able to track down, photography would still be a major part of O'Keeffe's story. It is not a story that began with Stieglitz, mind you. Get that out of your head right now. O'Keeffe was familiar with photography her whole life. Family photographs, studio portraits, and snapshots taken by friends mark her earliest decades. Here she is at the left at Lake George as an art student, long before she ever visited that landscape with Stieglitz. And there are hundreds of such early photos of O'Keeffe at the O'Keeffe Museum. Moreover, family albums that the O'Keeffes put together prove that they owned a Kodak camera and engaged in snapshot photography from around 1900. With the purchase of a Kodak camera, Kodak included a subscription to Kodakery Journal, which instructed users on good technique and suggested compositions like this one at the right. And you can see on the left a page from the O'Keeffe family album and one shot at the center that was clearly made under the influence of Kodak and the company's advice for good photography. The O'Keeffes, like many others, eagerly followed these Kodak suggestions. Now, I might have been born and raised in Ohio, but Texas is my home now, and so I'm proud to say that it's O'Keeffe's time in Canyon, Texas, where she began teaching in 1916, that produced the first photographs that we can confidently attribute to her. O'Keeffe's younger sister, Claudia, came to stay with her in Canyon to attend school and brought along a camera. Now, Claudia was a bit of a troublemaker, so the family kind of shipped her off to the other black sheep of the family to try and get her in line. Now, Georgia photographed her sister, seen here at the left, and Claudia, in turn, photographed her older sister, Georgia. After all, photography was a family pastime. It's what they knew. And Georgia sent several of these portrait snaps to her new friend, Alfred Stieglitz. Though O'Keeffe knew of Stieglitz, New York photographer, gallerist, art impresario, and had visited his gallery during her student days in New York, their relationship didn't begin until 1916, more than a decade after she first used a camera. And Stieglitz wasn't alone in receiving photos from Georgia before anyone runs away and thinks he's special or anything. She'd send prints to friends throughout her lifetime, and many of the prints that you'll see in the exhibition actually have lovely little notes on the back that she sent to people. Now, the story of O'Keeffe and Stieglitz's introduction is now famous. O'Keeffe's friend, Anita Pulitzer, brought Stieglitz a selection of O'Keeffe's charcoal drawings, and he was fascinated. He included the drawings, specials, as she called them, seen here, in his next group exhibition and in a subsequent solo exhibition. But with O'Keeffe in Texas at that time, their romantic relationship was kindled by written letters and shared snapshots. In May of 1917, O'Keeffe made a spur-of-the-moment trip from Canyon to New York City to see her exhibition at Stieglitz's gallery. Sadly, O'Keeffe's exhibition was already deinstalled, but Stieglitz rehung it for her. And if that doesn't say something about how much he loved her, I mean, ask any curator. We are not doing that nonsense. Afterward, O'Keeffe posed for him in front of several of her works. And this commenced Stieglitz's epic, systematic portrait that would result in hundreds of images of the painter. And their affections, of course, grew until O'Keeffe moved to New York in 1918 to be with Stieglitz and concentrate on her artistic practice full-time. Stieglitz, of course, was one of the most prominent early 20th century figures advocating for the acceptance of photography alongside other modern arts. And O'Keeffe met many photographers within Stieglitz's orbit, including Paul Strand, whose work such as Ceramic and Fruit from 1916 on the left helped O'Keeffe realize the abstracting potentials of light and shadow. And Todd Webb, whose work is on the right, whose humanistic work embodied photography's emotionally expressive potential. O'Keeffe became integral to Stieglitz's photographic activity. She designed and hung photography exhibitions at Stieglitz's gallery. She wrote about photography as an art form, and during her summers with him at Lake George, she kept track of Stieglitz's photographic equipment, she spotted his prints, and she mounted them. Now, during this time, O'Keeffe continued to photograph casually during Stieglitz's lifetime, most often creating sensitive images of her environment. But in such an O'Keeffe fashion, she was able to adapt anything to make it her own. And I love that photo on the right of their apartment, where you can see she's clearly brought one of her cow skulls back from New Mexico to hang it on the courtyard of their New York apartment. Now, it was after Stieglitz's death and the complex settlement of his estate and her permanent move to New Mexico that O'Keeffe began to practice art photography for herself and on her own terms. For the artist, photography offered the opportunity to render anew the elements of the world around her and to reassess their formal and expressive possibilities. O'Keeffe began her photographic practice in earnest in 1955 when photographer and friend Todd Webb stopped at her New Mexico home during his cross-country Guggenheim-supported project to document America. When he reached Abiquiu in the summer of 1955, Webb was exhausted from his journey. He was walking across the country. O'Keeffe convinced him to stay with her for more than 2 weeks, and during that time, O'Keeffe used Webb's camera to take several photographs of him, posed with a bicycle and eventually with the Vespa scooter that she insisted he purchase to get over the Rocky Mountains and finish his cross-country trek. For the next several years, Webb traveled to the artist's home in New Mexico in the summers, staying for weeks at a time, until he moved to Santa Fe in the early 1960s. The pair would frequently take long walks and share Webb's camera, photographing the Southwestern vistas around them. During his 1956 trip, Webb wrote in his journal, quote, "We also talk about painting and photography. I'm giving her a few lessons with the Leica and she'll probably get one. Funny, she knows nothing of the operation of a camera. She sees well, of course, and seems to have a photographic eye. She'll do well." O'Keeffe did get a Leica that year, but did not truly ever learn to operate it. For the next several years, O'Keeffe did much of her photographing during Webb's summer visits when the photographer was available to set the camera controls for her. And when he wasn't, she relied on a handwritten cheat sheet he had dictated, and you'll see that in the exhibition upstairs. Now, into the background. My own introduction to this subject was a chance comment made by Cody Hartley, director of the O'Keeffe Museum, that the museum had in its collection various unstudied photographs, possibly made by, but not of, the artist Georgia O'Keeffe. I was fascinated. I never heard that O'Keeffe had made photos. That history had been darkened by the shadow of Stieglitz. And the potential to bring to light a previously unrecognized chapter in O'Keeffe's life and career was too good to pass up. So this is one of my snapshots from my first trip to the O'Keeffe Museum. The photos that were under investigation were carefully arranged, numbered, and organized into binders, like any good museum would do. However, none were dated, and it was not clear if these even were taken by Georgia O'Keeffe. Now, some looked very much like O'Keeffe's drawings and paintings, with their familiar subject matter, careful attention to composition and detail, and rendering of light and shade as form. Now, others were more of a mystery. The subject matter could have attracted anyone's eye, and in the collection of the O'Keeffe Museum were many photos by many other artists. So as I flipped through the binders on that first trip, I really started to worry. Was this a project I wanted to take on? And how could it be done? And that's when I feel O'Keeffe herself sent me a small sign. I got to this picture, and I knew this was a project that could be done and needed to be done. So I'm hearing the murmurs, and I think some of you see it. Let me zoom in. So clearly reflected in that window is O'Keeffe herself with camera in hand, taking a photo of her beloved Abiquiu home. It was just one breadcrumb I eagerly followed on this path, and O'Keeffe left other breadcrumbs to follow. The artist herself wrote photography into her story with the publication of her 1976 Viking text, simply titled Georgia O'Keeffe. Now, O'Keeffe was obsessive. She maintained control of every aspect of this book. The title, the print size, the page type, the color, everything. But important to this study, she really thought about the limited amount of text and image that would go into this, which is why it's so fascinating that next to the seductive painting, Road Past the View, O'Keeffe wrote this. The road fascinates me with its ups and downs and finally its wide sweep as it speeds toward the wall of my hilltop to go past me. I had made 2 or 3 snaps of it with a camera. For one of them, I turned the camera at a sharp angle to get all the road. It was accidental that I made the road seem to stand up in the air, but it amused me, and I began drawing and painting it as a new shape. And you can see this painting and those exact photos on the walls of the exhibition. It's notable that this anecdote about photography was included in a slim book covering her entire 60-year career. In these lines, O'Keeffe writes photography clearly into her personal story and into the story of her art. It's her camera, her familiar subject matter, her photographs, and her abstracted interpretation of the world. She wanted us to know about her photographs. Now, other breadcrumbs were found at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where 7 photos by O'Keeffe had been sitting in the collection, never studied or displayed. And let me tell you, this gave me a lot of power around the Museum of Fine Arts Houston office for a little bit, because some of you might not know, but my boss in photography, Malcolm Daniel, was the head curator at the Met for 25 years and never knew about these photos. So I liked poking him about that a little bit. They were gifted in 1977, and the official credit line for those photographs is anonymous gift. Yet the barely concealed secret at the Met is that these photographs were a gift of the artist herself. She was working closely with the museum in that year on an exhibition and catalog titled Alfred Stieglitz, and then decided to deposit some of her own photographs with the museum at that same time. So with these hints to urge me on, I spent the next several years traveling across the country with many stops in Santa Fe, trying to see every photograph that may have been taken by O'Keeffe, seeking out photos buried in archives and in dusty manila folders. O'Keeffe often mailed photographs to friends with quick handwritten messages on the back, so examining every possible contact and friendship she maintained in that time became essential. Now, I had a firm starting point for identifying an original O'Keeffe. Some photographs were clearly and definitively hers. O'Keeffe's snaps from Hawaii are her first significant body of photographs, so rather than a 1 or 2 snapshots, we get a body of work to examine. Now, in 1939, O'Keeffe accepted an invitation to Hawaii to produce paintings for the Hawaiian Pineapple Company. We know them as Dole now. I will tell you, she went, she loved it, and she never produced a pineapple painting in her time there. They had to ship a pineapple back to New York so that she would paint it there. But her Hawaii snaps, as they are labeled on the envelope in which they were found, capture subject matter that is quintessentially O'Keeffe. including dramatic landforms and perfect flower blooms. These are the first body of photos we have. So they demonstrate her fundamental approach and process. What these Hawaii snaps reveal is her primary interest in photography, reframing. And that is moving from left to right, or right to left, or in the case of these sugarcane images on the right of the screen, angling the camera from high back to low. O'Keeffe reframed the same subject to produce slightly varied compositions in her search for the best formal relationships. In this sequence, depicting a lava arch, the rock in the foreground is given more prominence over the subsequent frames. And the serial nature of the photographs gives us a rare glimpse into her artist mind at work as she tested the ratio of forms in the composition. From this first group of images, O'Keeffe's individual approach to the medium is evident. Reframing. It's the most common formal device in O'Keeffe's photographs, and it distinguishes her work from that of other photographers. While other photographers might crop or enlarge a single negative in the darkroom to produce new images, O'Keeffe did it in camera, producing sequential frames with small compositional shifts. No other photographer in her circle approached the medium in this way. The early Hawaii photographs make clear that reframing was a technique she intuitively brought to photography, not one she inherited from Stieglitz or was taught by Todd Webb in conjunction with the medium. Now, O'Keeffe reframed in all of her work. The series Shell and Old Shingle from the 1920s demonstrates application of reframing in her paintings. O'Keeffe's emphasis in the series was the relationship between the separate forms. Quote, "They fascinated me so that I forgot what they were, except that they were shapes together, singing shapes." This emphasis on the relationship between forms within the frame can be traced to O'Keeffe's most influential teacher, Arthur Wesley Dow. Though O'Keeffe summarized Dow's techniques in a single phrase, quote, "fill space in a beautiful way," this brevity really belies the importance of this revelation in her life and in her work. It was essentially her guiding principle. And while she did not learn to photograph from Dow, his instruction seeded an understanding of both reframing and photography's characteristics. So let me demonstrate. Another student of Dow's, painter Max Weber, described one of the master's teaching methods, and I'll read it to you. Dow would come into class and make an unbounded drawing of trees and hills or perhaps a winding road against the sky. Then he would ask the class to copy parts of the drawing and enclose them in a rectangle to make a horizontal picture or a vertical picture, to balance the drawing by making less foreground or more sky, to change the masses and whatnot. So that exercise that Dow impressed on his students is nearly photographic. It's a technique of framing and reframing to find the best composition. And in 1916 and 17 in Canyon, Texas, O'Keeffe applied these lessons to her drawing of Palo Duro Canyon. In several examples, she drew the landforms of the Texas Panhandle both in vertical format and horizontal format, each time filling her small sheet of paper with a harmonious balance of linear forms. O'Keeffe used Dow's lessons when she picked up a camera, and the vast majority of O'Keeffe's photographs incorporate reframing of some type. But where O'Keeffe parts ways with Dow is in her treatment of light and shadow. For Dow, shadows were mere fleeting effects of the sun, not relevant to the composition, certainly not shapes to be aware of. For O'Keeffe, shadows and bursts of light were not fleeting effects. They were forms and shapes as weighty and essential as mesas and mountains. Sensitive to the formal potential of light and shade, O'Keeffe photographed the same view throughout the day, embracing the shadow and light as forms, allowing their shifts to reframe the scene and create different compositions. This sequence of 5 Polaroids was taken in the exact same position at Glen Canyon and demonstrates O'Keeffe's interest in light to reframe the scene for her. As the morning sun shifted, the scene changed, and O'Keeffe captured each variation with her camera. In other words, O'Keeffe captured shifts in light and shadow as form to reframe her scene. This interest in light as form is evident in her photos and in her paintings. But to be honest, it wasn't one I had appreciated before seeing it captured again and again in her photographs. Now, seasonal change was also important to O'Keeffe. The cycle of seasons naturally reframes the landscape. Plants thin or bloom, snow covers the ground, colors deepen and change. Light too changes. The varied intensity of daylight throughout the year creates new patterns of light and shade. And nature's cycle would reframe O'Keeffe's environment, and O'Keeffe would capture it with her camera. Here, she has photographed the road outside her window in both spring and winter. Nearly identical in position, the photographs are incredibly different, just due to those changes wrought by the season. Now, that's the exhibition in a nutshell, reframing light and seasons, the ways O'Keeffe used her camera. But what I found as I worked on this project is that people usually have more questions. The one most frequently asked is how. How did I determine definitively that the photos going on the wall were exactly by Georgia O'Keeffe? How did I date them? It's a very long story, but I'll give you some of the highlights and a peek behind the curatorial curtain. So, because the Hawaii snaps were firmly attributed to Georgia O'Keeffe, I had a foundation to work from, a way to understand her photographic approach, and that is reframing. But there were many photos in the O'Keeffe Museum collection and others in archives that demonstrated something like a clumsier, more extreme form of reframing, such as these images. So how was I to say definitively that the photo on the left is by O'Keeffe and the photo on the right was not? And how do you date it? Well, overall, I relied on a 2-point system, 2 documented facts, 2 things I could prove, had to confirm that one photograph was hers. But those facts varied wildly depending on what photograph it was. In addition to her trademark style, could I confirm that she was there, as you can see, at that exact place at that exact time? Was it on the right paper, et cetera, et cetera? Now, I started by building, still makes me nervous. I started by building an epic timeline, reading and referencing as many letters as I could found at the library in Santa Fe, at the Beinecke, at other archives of O'Keeffe's friends, such as Laura Gilpin in Fort Worth, Marjorie Content in New York City, Francis O'Brien in Arizona, Todd Webb in Portland, the list goes on and on. I began to fill out a timeline of O'Keeffe's movements, beginning in 1955, the year she began to photograph. We know she was a prolific writer, and she would always note her location and activities in her correspondence. So here you see just a sliver of that timeline, January to August 1956. And I would include every relevant clue about her travels, interests, and visitors that I could gather. Details gleaned from the photographs themselves led to additions to the timeline and opened up new possibilities for attribution. For example, do you see how different the adobe looks in these 2 photos of her studio door? And trust me, if you had been staring at these like I had for a year, you would definitely see it. Well, I learned that that was due to remudding of the adobe walls in O'Keeffe's home. So I researched what months and years she had the mud adobe redone. And then I compared the adobe cracks in the photos to dated images by many of the photographers that came to visit her, so I could narrow in on a date. Until in 1959, she's tricky, she switched from mud adobe to cementous adobe. So can you tell the difference between mud and cement adobe visually? Well, I had no idea. So I asked for help from New Mexico preservation officers who taught me how to identify different adobe types by look. This allowed me to determine if the photos were taken before or after the switch in 1959. Are you with me? All right. And with her trips to New York City on my timeline, I cross-referenced them with the construction of the buildings in these photos, such as the Seagram's building on the left, only completed in 1958, and the various apartments on the right. The ever-changing landscape of New York was really helpful to me in this regard. And this is what I'm going to become famous for, guys. For a while, my office at the museum was wallpapered with images of O'Keeffe's chows. There were many photographs of the chows, but none were dated. So I began to add any correspondence about the dogs to my timeline. While many researchers have shown interest in O'Keeffe's pets, it was never clearly determined how many dogs she had or when she had them. Now, I can't blame them, because that issue was really muddied by the fact that O'Keeffe recycled names for her pets. It is true. Shameful but true. Chia and Bo, her first chows, are seen here in photos by Marjorie Content. But those two dogs passed away before O'Keeffe began to photograph. But she subsequently shared her home with Inca, Chia 2, Bo 2, Chia 3, Inca 2, and the only red one with the different name, Jingo. He's easy to identify. Now, I couldn't date the photos without identifying the dogs. So I worked with dog show judges and chow breeders sensitive to the differences in structure, coat, and size to tell one dog from another. They were also very helpful in saying this is about a 2-year-old chow. As a result, I was able to create the definitive O'Keeffe dog family tree. And oh my gosh, do I hope that some other researcher finds it useful for something. Because that would certainly make me feel better about the time I expended thinking about these chows. Similarly, I hope that future researchers appreciate the work done on Glen Canyon. O'Keeffe visited in 1961, 1964, and 1965, producing photographs on her first 2 visits. But Glen Canyon stretches between 2 states, Utah and Arizona, and covers over 1 million, yes, 1 million acres. So where in this expansive canyon were the photos taken? Because the location would determine the dates, as O'Keeffe visited different sites in the canyon during 61 and 64. So I found my new best friend, a river runner, the wonderful Ryan Savino, who specializes in trips down the Grand Canyon and Glen Canyon. Armed with copies of the photos and the advice of the older generation of river runners, Ryan helped me identify the locations in which the photos were taken, and then that helped establish the dates. Now, if any of you are interested, we pinned all the locations on a Google map color-coded by year of the trip, so I'm happy to report that at least this has been helpful to some Glen Canyon historians. And speaking of maps, the wonderful Peta Lopez, one of O'Keeffe's last personal assistants, let me wander the O'Keeffe home anywhere I wanted to go, plotting the exact points in which the pictures were taken. So this is my hand-drawn map, guys. With my obsessive notes on place and direction, I was trying to determine if she always photographed at the same time of day. Was this a scheduled practice? And spoiler alert, it was not. You can see my little letters corresponding to images and noting the direction they were taken and also northern direction. I was trying to figure out sun patterns here. And as well as I came to know O'Keeffe through my research and my timeline, I came to know Todd Webb almost as well. Through his daily journal, which, is a researcher's dream come true, I learned that Todd Webb not only taught O'Keeffe to photograph, but also processed her film and printed most of her photos. So I want to repeat that. He printed her photos. In Todd Webb's archive at the Center for Creative Photography in Arizona, I discovered his order form for photographic paper, which you can see here at the right. It was a huge boon to my research because I was able to beg some of those exact paper samples, Kodak medalist single and double weight from 1955 to 1960, from conservator extraordinaire Paul Messier at Yale, who is putting together what you see on the left, a collection and database of photo paper types throughout the 20th century. So, with samples in one hand and possible O'Keeffe photos in the other, I was able to compare paper types, often ruling out a photo as an official O'Keeffe if it was not made on any paper type that Todd Webb used. The papers also helped to narrow date ranges because company backstamping, as you can see here, and paper offerings changed pretty frequently over time. In other words, I was the crazy girl in the corner of the archive, holding prints and paper samples up to raking light and attempting to compare surface texture and counting fiber weave per centimeter. And as exciting as this was, super exciting, it did leave one major problem. It meant that O'Keeffe photographs were on the same paper as Todd Webb photographs. Additionally, they also traded cameras back and forth, meaning that their individual images would appear on the same roll of film. Now, this is a contact sheet from the Todd Webb archive, and for those of you who have photographed before, you understand that -1 is bottom, 2 middle, 3 top. But it shows O'Keeffe posing in the first frame and Todd Webb in the exact same place in the second, clearly showing they take turns behind the camera. And because these friends were often at the same place, at the same time, their prints are on the same paper and negatives on the same roll, it became absolutely critical to be able to tell their work apart. Well, this is where O'Keeffe's consistent vision in painting, drawing, or photography truly saved the day. Her way of reframing, not cropping, not enlarging, but creating a whole new capture was unique. She did it in her drawings, her paintings, and her photographs. Her artistic vision in all media was wholly her own and could be relied on to differentiate her images from Todd Webb's. Now, notably, when I went to the Todd Webb archive to comb through the negatives and contact sheets from Todd's 20 years photographing with Georgia O'Keeffe to identify her images amid Webb's, there was never any disagreement with director Betsy Evans Hunt, who knows Webb best, about whose images were whose. On contact sheets such as this, with both Webb's and O'Keeffe's images, we could instantly differentiate each artist's unique eye. And I hope by now, with all this talk of reframing, that you can too. So which are Webb's and which are O'Keeffe's? I'll give you a minute. I'm gonna take a drink. Are we ready? Okay. If you need to be sure you've made the right attribution, I'll tell you. Did you get it right? Ah, look at you guys, all right. It has been a long and fascinating journey discovering the photographic work of Georgia O'Keeffe, but all the hunting, close looking, and discovering taught me so much about how this incredible artist saw the world and approached her art. And while I feel like my task is done, this project has raised fascinating and new questions about this famous artist. And I wanted to note just a few tonight in the hopes that someone in the audience will take the reins and answer these questions for all of us. So here are your new questions. What is the relationship in terms of timeline between her paintings and photographs? In the case of Road Past the View, O'Keeffe herself says, I made 2 or 3 snaps of it with a camera and then painted it as a new shape. The photos came first in this case, but in these examples, the painting Small Purple Hill was done in the 1940s and the photograph wasn't made until the 1970s, so clearly the photo comes much later. So what is that timeline? And what is the relationship between her photos, paintings, and her many drawings of Glen Canyon? What is the order and why? What can it teach us? And while I've identified 409 images by O'Keeffe, all depicted in the catalog, and here's my unabashed plug, I hope you all get one. It would make my editor and publisher really happy. How many more photos are out there waiting to be discovered? As I mentioned, O'Keeffe sent them to friends with written messages on the back. Many that I found were stored in letters still, in envelopes, tucked into forgotten folders in archives. How many more are there? Are there new compositions we have yet to discover? And finally, one of my favorite mysteries, during my intense examination of the paper, I began to notice that many of the photographs had paint splashes, ink spots, and others had residue in all 4 corners of the back. Now, my conservator calls this minor skinning, but I think most of you, if you can see that right there, can probably identify that as a tape mark. You know, when you tape the back of a photo and then rip the tape off later? That fuzzy texture happens when tape is pulled away. Were these taped in her studio, in her home? Why? So maybe you are the one who will dig in and answer these questions. I feel like my work is done. I called those dog breeders and the Adobe guys. I worked with the river runner. I've identified her photos. Check. And I will be cheering on the next researcher who takes that foundation and continues on, providing us with another lens to understand the amazing Georgia O'Keeffe photographer. Thank you. Happy to take questions.
Please wait for the microphone. If you've got questions, raise your hand.
Hi, Lisa. I'll start us off with one that I'm sure people are going to have a lot of questions that bring you back to O'Keeffe, so I'm going to throw in a little curveball at the beginning. So you talked a lot about this incredibly close photographic relationship between O'Keeffe and Webb, and you're also working on a project where you're looking at Webb and Robert Frank. So I'm wondering what are the similarities and differences that you're finding in terms of how Webb is relating to people photographically? Can you talk a little bit about that project?
Sure. So my next project is a project about Todd Webb and Robert Frank. So in 1955, the year that Todd Webb is walking across the country on a Guggenheim-sponsored fellowship and stops in O'Keeffe's house for 2 weeks, the most famous photographer really in our American history, Robert Frank, also has a Guggenheim and is driving across the country. So these two men are doing these cross-country journeys at the same time, but in radically different ways. And I think learning more about Todd through Georgia, like how she saw him, has helped me identify the emotional differences between Frank and Webb. I mean, I think you can tell. There's a kind of person that's gonna walk across the country, guys, and there's a kind of person that's like, I'm getting a car, I'm driving. And their photos reflect those different personalities. But Webb's work has never, ever, ever, ever been seen before, whereas Robert Frank went on to produce the most famous photo book ever, The Americans. I see lots of nodding, you guys know that book. So I had to comb through more than 10,000 of Todd's negatives to choose the works for this upcoming exhibition. So lots of on-the-ground research again. Yes. Oh, I think you're supposed to wait.
That was delightful, by the way,
Thank
your
you.
presentation. I'm just going to follow up on that Todd Webb's photographs have never been seen. He just has negatives that you have and that you're choosing and editing and putting together from his negatives.
Yes.
So why didn't he
Great question.
do anything with the work?
Great question. I called. How did Todd Webb's negatives go away? Like, why don't we know him? Is that pretty much it? I will start by admitting, and Betsy Evans Hunt, who's the director of the Todd Webb Archive, was here earlier, and she loves this. She tells everyone this. Todd Webb is like my photographic archival crush. My husband's in the front row, I'm sorry, honey. But he has a daily journal. He has letters to people. He was the sweetest man ever. And photographers that knew him will tell you the same, just generous and giving and amazing. He didn't care about making a profit. He actually writes in his journal, if he could make $15,000 a year, he'd be okay. Like, he had no desire for money or fame. He just wanted to make these photos. And in 1976, there was a group of, it was kind of like a lawyer, a gallerist, a group of men kind of going around the country and buying up the archives of photographers. And they bought Walker Evans' archive. They bought the prints that Robert Frank had left in his darkroom from the Americans and bought his copyright, and they bought Todd Webb's entire archive. Now, while the Evans eventually goes to the Met and Frank fights and fights and gets his material back, Webb just kind of let it go. And his work was only recently rediscovered in a series of trunks in a basement in Oakland, California. So he was absent in those critical decades of the late 70s, early 80s, when the histories of photography were being written, when they were being talked about in new university courses. You don't have any Webbs to show, so he ends up being out of the conversation.
I believe
He's
we've got a
very
question
famous.
over here. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
I have two questions, actually. The first one is, several years ago, we saw a wonderful exhibit in Palm Beach, Florida, that was an exhibit of Ansel Adams' photographs with her paintings of the same images. And they had done this together. Are there any photographs that she took with Ansel Adams?
Okay, everyone,
Yeah.
grab onto your seat. I just want you to be prepared for this. She didn't like Ansel Adams.
Oh,
You got it? She didn't ever work with him, so the similarities between their work is because of the similarities between subject matter. They didn't ever go out and make art together. She took one trip with him in California, but I know most people have this impression that they were like besties or something, and so I hid it in my catalog, but if you are a great reader, one of the notes for the essay in the catalog will tell you exactly how she felt about Ansel Adams. And I'll just give you a sneak preview. She called him a half thing.
wow.
And was there a second question?
Yes. But no more about that. Yes, almost all of these are black and white. Mm-hmm. Is that a preference, or is it because color photography just wasn't that popular?
Preference.
Preference.
Which is crazy, because this is an artist we know for her color. Her paintings are beautifully colored. Sorry, I'll back up. I'll talk right back here. Her paintings are beautifully colored. It's what we know about her, and yet she was choosing black and white for photography. The Polaroid camera that she used, and she loved it, again, because she didn't want to bother with the aperture, shutter speed, and she didn't want to bother with printing, so she loved the fact that she could just pick this thing up and click and the photo would spit out, right? She chose black and white film for her Polaroid. Color was more readily available at that time. Another mystery to be solved.
Any other questions?
Any other questions? No. That's it?
No, I have one. You did research on a lot of different aspects, Adobe, Chow's, paper, and so on. Did you work on all those simultaneously, or how did you prioritize?
I don't know. I can tell you the Chows were last. They were like a huge hurdle. I had, they were literally tacked up in my office for like a year, and then COVID hit, and I just moved that into my home office. It was just covered in Chow photos, and I would just stare at things and try and figure out how I could possibly figure this out. What is in the photo itself that can tell me something? So the Chows were last. Most of the other things were happening simultaneously. So, I'm talking to these guys in Abiquiu about Adobe while Ryan Savino is on her river trip trying to find me those spots. And these are all not only essential to proving it was O'Keeffe and dating it, but also essential to how we understand it. So, for example, I'll go back. These photos from Glen Canyon, these 5 at the bottom, they're Polaroids, which means they didn't come on a roll of film, and I can't know the order, right? So in order to understand if she's watching the sun change one way or the other, what's first, what's last, I had to know where it was taken. I had to know where the sun was coming from, which meant I had to find the location in order to put it in the correct order. So these things were absolutely essential to the process and had to happen all at once.
Think we have time for, I'm not exactly sure what time it is, but maybe we have time for about 2 more. So I saw this hand and this hand first. I'm sorry.
How long did it take you to research all of this? And then did you get to a point where you just wanted to give up, or what kept you going?
It was about 3 solid years of research, but I am research obsessed. It's what I love to do. Yeah, as you can tell. I would feel like giving up. There were times I was like, how important is it that I really can give you a year for this? But can't I just say 50 to 70 and call it good? Oh, this is gonna sound really woo-woo and really reveal my time in California. But O'Keeffe writes a lot in her letters about sending people tiny feathers that she would find. She would go out on a walk every single day, and she would often find really small feathers on her walk, and she would send them to people. And there were a few times when I was feeling very frustrated that I would go out for a walk, and inevitably there would be a really small feather there. And I just felt like she was urging me on. Aw. Thanks, guys.
If these are Polaroids, are they disintegrating? Are you saving them? Are they fading?
They are, light exposure is problematic for any photograph. The Polaroids are a little scary, especially because she doesn't like the process. So those streaks you see on the Polaroids in the exhibition is because she didn't coat them properly. So yes, that's why we're ending the exhibition here. That's why they're going back to sleep at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum after this to preserve them for the future. But now they've all been photographed, documented, they're in the catalog, Oh yeah, the catalog has everything. Get the catalog. Oh, I don't want to end like that. That was terrible. I'm sorry, guys.
All right, we'll take one more question
Thank
right
you.
over here.
Okay. Whew.
might not be like happier, but at the beginning you highlighted how photography was something that she wasn't taught by these male counterparts of her.
Yes.
How much of the fact that this photography wasn't previously studied was because of these kind of narratives around her being, as a female artist, painting these pretty paintings, while these male counterparts are the ones who taught her these things, not her own agency over these photographs?
I would say 100%. I think the shadow of Stieglitz being kind of like the first name of American photography, and knowing he created more than 300 portraits of her, makes you automatically put her in the position of in front of the lens. She never, you don't think of her behind the camera. And admittedly, I'm always interested to see what the individual museums will do with the labels, whether they put Georgia O'Keeffe at the top of every single one of those labels. And I admit I did it in Houston because I was still a little freaked out. Doing the research for this for a very long time and talking to all these scholars of O'Keeffe's work who had been there before, many of them were dismissive. Like, oh, she just did snapshots, or those aren't anything to look at. We can't learn anything from that. Like, I heard it a lot. Or she couldn't have taken those. That had to have been either Stieglitz or Webb. And so my anxiety about that, I think, came out in the exhibition a little, because I was like, Georgia O'Keeffe, Georgia O'Keeffe, Georgia O'Keeffe. I was like obsessively doing that. So yeah, it still exists. Yeah. Thank you.